In 1999, a TV show came out called Freaks and Geeks. I did not watch it at the time, but thanks to one of the many streaming services Jane mentioned, I recently went back and watched the entirety of it. It was only one season. It was about high school kids trying to figure out how to fit in and belong. If you watched it in the original, you probably wondered, who are all these actors? When you go back and watch it now, all of them are famous in their own ways. But it's a show about belonging, and there's one particular episode that stands out, and the scene is one that is in other TV shows and movies. I don't know if they still do this, but it's one where people had to pick teams in gym class. Now, if you're picking teams in gym class, what is it that you are trying to avoid? Getting picked last. Now, this is where a show about belonging had an episode where belonging really gets pushed to its limits, because you have, right, the two athletes in the class get picked to pick teams. The first one picks somebody that they no doubt think is a friend and is a good athlete. But as you work your way down, even being second to last, someone has to say your name, right? They may not really want you on their team, but they have to speak your name out loud and invite you to join their team. If you're last, they don't even have to say your name. They just kind of go, yep, and then you just walk over there because you got picked last. And this is what the show is. They're trying not to get picked last, because they know that that's that terrible feeling of not belonging. Now, we belong in all sorts of ways to all kinds of communities. We can belong to families, we can belong to churches, to community groups, to schools, to fraternities. And in all of those places, I think we are built to belong as human beings. We are created for community, and I think we long to belong. And so when we're trying to fit in, and if we don't, if we're picked last, or if we otherwise are in a space in life where we don't have a place where we belong, that can be a hard and lonely space to live. It can be some of the hardest spaces we live, because we feel like we're just completely all by ourselves and don't have a place for what we're built for, right? Built for belonging and created for community. I think of when I went my freshman year in college to the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology in Terre Haute, Indiana, I knew I wasn't going to know anybody there. And I was a chronically shy introvert. And so I was not expecting belonging to come easy. And when we got there, we had this big gray 1989 Dodge conversion van, and we pulled up, and my mom and I went in to find where my room was. We found somebody with a clipboard that took us up to the third floor, and by the time we got there, my stuff was already in the room. They had a welcome team of coming back students whose job was to welcome you and help you to begin to belong. So already you start to feel like you fit in. And then our resident assistant sat us down, and pretty quickly I had a group of friends on the floor. We ate all our meals together. We played basketball outside together. We belonged as a community. And there were other groups on the floor, but I'm betting there was at least a few people who didn't fit in, right? They didn't find belonging. And then the fraternities came around and invited people, right? Because that's another place that you can belong. And so we had that sense of belonging. Now, the thing is, when we belong to a group of people, we have sometimes explicit, sometimes unwritten values, stories, inside jokes that help reinforce our sense of belonging. So as a congregation, we talk about being welcoming, right? That's part of our narrative and story. Another example, I grew up in St. Louis, and I belong to what we would call Cardinal Nation, St. Louis Cardinal fans, wherever we happen to live. And we would tell you, as part of our group identity, that we are the best fans in baseball. And the reason we are the best fans in baseball is because this is our narrative. We do not boo, and we clap for the other team when they play well, even if it costs us a run. So I've been to spring training games in Lakeland when they're playing the Tigers, and I always know if I'm sitting with the Cardinal fans, not just because they all have on Cardinals gear, but because Detroit makes a good play and everybody goes, yep, that was a good play, nice job, right? But that's part of the narrative, and it's part of the belonging, and you learn that as you grow up going to games because it's part of that group identity. This also can happen at any level of community, right? We have national sense of who we are. Even in our families, I remember when I was younger, and if we had a loss in a game or something wasn't going well, my dad would say, keep your head up, you're a Hoven. I'm not actually sure what he meant by that, but what I do know is when he said that, I felt like I belonged to a family, and my parents had my back, and they were my cheerleaders, and then I wasn't going to be journeying through that stuff on my own. So belonging is important. We're built for it. We're created for community, but belonging can also have a dark side. I everything I've read about extremist groups and gangs and people that wreak violence in the world is that they actually start with belonging. They go and find the kid that got picked on for the color of his skin or his accent or being quirky and weird, and they give that person a place of belonging. It doesn't start off in the extreme bits. You say, hey, you're welcome here. If this is what I would do if I was going to start a Christian extremist group. I would start with belonging. I would talk all about the love and grace of Jesus, just like we do all the time. And I would do that for a good while till you felt like you fit in. And then I would say, those other people, they don't belong to us. And by the way, they hate us, and right? And then you start to build a narrative of us against them. So belonging, we're built for it, but if we use it to separate and divide, that's when it can get pretty violent and pretty dark pretty fast. The other dark side, I think, of belonging is that we, those narratives we have, aren't always accurate. I actually went to a Cardinal game in St. Louis a couple years ago, and the crowd booed. I was shocked. And so I had to wrestle with, did the narrative never was really true? Is it just a story we told ourselves, or has the narrative changed and that belonging has changed in some way? And this is what we find when we come to today's gospel passage. Jesus is talking to people who belong together. They are Hebrew people in the Roman Empire. They certainly had an identity that said, this is who we are, and that is who they are. They understood what their scriptures told them about who they were. And when Jesus says, if you continue to follow me, you will be free. He says, you will know the truth, right? Well, Jesus is the truth, so they kind of already know him. But he's saying, you have to keep knowing me, and that's how you're free. And they immediately go, hold on. We are children of Abraham. We've never been slaves to anybody. Now, it's important that they said children of Abraham. Because had they just said, we have never been slaves to anybody, they could have just been talking about themselves. And they may not have been slaves in their lives. But they pointed back to Abraham. So if you go all the way back to Abraham and then work your way forward, you go Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Oh, and then there was that really long time where we were slaves in Egypt. And then God freed us from that, and then we had all the kings. And then there's that time where they carried us off to Babylon and some of us were slaves, right? They forgot in their narrative that the history of their belonging had included time where they were refugees in foreign places and enslaved. And the reason that's important is because their own scriptures, God says to them in several places, welcome the stranger among you. Remembering that you used to be strangers in a foreign land yourself. The remembering of their belonging is that it's meant for everybody, right? You were blessed to be a blessing. And the fact that as they're talking to Jesus, they forgot that part. They forgot that they had been a time when they were slaves as a people, when they were in a foreign place as refugees. And so if you forget that, because God told you to remember it, now when you're encountering people that are different from you who don't belong to you, it's easy to forget that you were blessed to be a blessing and start to live into some of that dark side of belonging. So Jesus then starts to teach them different and says, anybody that's a slave to sin, anybody that sins is a slave to sin. And we would, if we understand sin as missing the mark of what God calls us to, do we all ever 100% get that right all the time? No. So Jesus is telling them, everybody is a slave to sin. And the slave does not have a permanent place in the household, which means Jesus now is talking about belonging. Already, they have referenced that they forgot about how God reminds them about belonging. So Jesus brings it to belonging and says, if you're a slave to sin, you don't have a permanent place. But if the Son makes a place for you, then you do. If the Son makes you free, you are free indeed. He is looking ahead to his death and resurrection where he is going to make a place for everyone. Now, Jesus doesn't pick teams the way we had to do in gym class. And if he did do it that way, he would pick the last first and the first last, right? Because he tells us that. But on the cross, Jesus reaches his arms out and gathers up the whole of creation into reconciliation with God. So what Jesus is saying is, I am going to make everyone belong. That is what the Son does. And if everybody belongs, then you are free. Now, this is where I think this gets tricky for us as modern-day Americans, because when we hear freedom, I think we have certain things we attach to that go with our big group identity. Primarily, my guess is we think about our own rights, right? I want my rights to be not impinged upon. I want my freedoms to be wide open. I want to do what I want to do. Not that worried about your freedoms, right? But mine are good. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying, because he's talking about belonging. So if God has given you belonging because Jesus made it so, then you're free. Free from what? Having to work at belonging. Now, this is where this gets tricky, because as people, we do find times where we don't fit in. But this is where I think Jesus is inviting us to be free to go and be the belonging community that we were created to be. The church, one of the images for the church is that we are the body of Christ. That's about belonging, right? Paul says that there are people with, there's the highly honored members and the weaker members, but everybody has gifts, and all of us make one body. And we talk about one baptism, right? There's only one baptism. There's one faith, one Lord. When we say the Nicene Creed, we say we believe in one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So I think what Jesus is saying is, because I have made belonging not an issue, you all belong to God, now go and be the community of faith that makes belonging happen in the world, that helps there not to be people that are left out, that helps everyone to find a place to fit in. Now the trick with that is, if that's what it means to be free, that we can go do that, there actually is like a way to do that, which is to be faithful people, and then you have to start paying attention to commandments and like what does it mean to be a community that has rules and constitutions and all this kind of structure-y stuff that doesn't sound like freedom. But I think that's exactly what it is, and I'm going to give you a few examples. Do kids do better with boundaries and limits, or just let run wild? Right? Giving them some boundaries gives them the freedom and safety to live. I was on a project once in the business world that was just complete chaos. We had a meeting every month, and the meeting, everybody was talking over each other. We didn't ever get any work done. Crisis after crisis. Every meeting was almost a fight. And how much work do you think we got done together? None. Were we free? No, we were captive to all of this chaos that was constantly going on. So I got a new boss, and he came in and did this brilliant, unheard of thing and made an agenda. And the agenda walked us through business, and then at the end of the agenda, this was the thing. Any old agenda wouldn't have worked. The end of the agenda just said, like, round table. And he sat down at the first meeting and said, before we get started, I know you all have a lot to say. When we get to that item in the agenda, you can say whatever you want. And it immediately stopped people talking over each other. And then we worked our way through the agenda every month, and we started to actually get things done. Did we still have crises? Yes, but we actually now we're working more as a team and able to live into that. So the order and the structure actually freed us to do what we were supposed to do. Similarly, most of you have probably gathered that I love to write. If you just give me an unbounded assignment and say, write as much as you want about whatever you want, I will promise you it will be terrible. But if you tell me you have 350 words to say this, that sounds restrictive, but it actually forces me to really think through what I'm trying to say and what words say that best. And it frees me in a weird way to be more creative because I have to fit it in that space. The shortest one I've had is 900 characters, including spaces, commas, and punctuation. And it seems restricting, but it's actually quite freeing as you live into it. All of this is to say, as those people were with Jesus and he said, the Son makes you free indeed, I think what he's really saying to them and to us is, God has got you. I have made it so. Now go be obedient to all this faithful stuff that I've called you to do. Pray for your enemies, love your neighbors, feed hungry people, but be a community of belonging. Be the body of Christ. And that may feel rigid and structured sometimes. It may not feel like freedom, but it is freedom because it invites us into the places where God gives us life because we were created for community and we thrive in community and we were built for belonging, and God has given us that to do. As we head into the next year as a congregation, if you read all that stewardship stuff we send you, you will find that it is really focused on belonging. It comes out of Acts where it says the disciples were devoted to the teaching of the apostles, the fellowship, breaking of the bread, and the prayers. All of those things are communal acts of belonging. So we are going to venture into being devoted to belonging But not just here, right? Because then that becomes the darker side of belonging. It's here, but also going out into the world to bring that belonging to everybody we meet so that everybody can know that Jesus has gathered them up in God's love. Amen.